Hello everybody, welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course, horror. Thank you for choosing my video. Hope you stick around because today I'll be covering everything I read this September. This was a great reading month for me because I really enjoyed everything that I picked up. I read 6 books this month, including 3 contemporary horror books, 1 recent release, and 3 fantasy books, including a 2-book urban fantasy series. I'll talk about each in order of my favorites of the month, starting off with my least favorite. Alright, let's talk about Dawnshard by Brandon Sanderson, the next book I tackled in the Stormlight Archive. It's actually a novella meant to be read between books 3 and 4. So if you're following the series, this one comes after Oathbringer and before Rhythm of War. Now, if you've seen my August wrap-up video, you might remember I reviewed Edgedancer and I mentioned that it was not quite a hit for me. Dawnshard, however, was a different experience and I enjoyed it a lot more. The story follows Lopin and Risen, 2 characters I already cared about after Oathbringer. Unlike Edgedancer, where I struggled to connect with Lift, I found myself really enjoying Lopin's humor and Risen's journey in this novella. They brought a lot of heart to the story, and that made a huge difference in my engagement. I also enjoyed how much Sanderson revealed about the Cosmere, the larger interconnected universe he's creating. Without giving any spoilers away, Dawnshard had some exciting secrets and lore that got me thinking about how all of these pieces will be fitting together. It added a lot of depth to this amazingly crafted world and left me with even more questions about the bigger picture, which has been fun to geek out about as I continue through the series. Unlike Edgedancer, this novella flew by. I never felt bored, and I think it's a great warm-up for Rhythm of War, which I have been currently reading but I didn't manage to finish in time for this wrap-up. But overall, I gave Dawnshard 3.5 stars. Next up is Such Sharp Teeth by Rachel Harrison, a horror romance that really surprised me in the best way. I feel like horror and romance are 2 genres that don't typically go well together, in my opinion, unless they typically would have to be a tragedy or they blend in humor and self-awareness. But Rachel Harrison does the latter to great effect here. It was such a fun read with a blend of spooky and rom-com vibes that really worked well for me. The story follows Rory, who returns to her small town to be closer to her pregnant twin sister. Shortly after arriving, she has a run-in with a werewolf and her life changes drastically. Now she's dealing with the challenge of being a werewolf while also navigating personal relationships and the normal chaos of life. While the werewolf transformations aren't super frequent or overly graphic, Harrison manages to describe them in a detailed way that adds to the eerie supernatural vibe without making the story too dark. What really made this book work for me was how well Rachel Harrison blended horror and romance with humor. The tone is witty and self-aware, which sets it apart from a lot of horror stories out there, a lot of horror stories that I've read. It doesn't take itself too seriously, and that works in its favor. Rory as a character is clever and relatable, and her voice reminded me of someone you might read in an Emily Henry romance novel, for example. She's sharp, funny, and very grounded despite the werewolf drama. Such Sharp Teeth really sold me on Rachel Harrison as a writer, and I'm excited to read more from her. Overall, I gave this one 3.5 stars. It's not a traditional horror novel, but if you're in the mood for something fun, light, and perfect for Halloween, this is a great choice. Next, I want to talk about Vicious and Vengeful by V.E. Schwab, which I'm reviewing together since they're both part of the same series. From the very opening of Vicious, I was hooked. It reads like a gritty crime novel, but with a dark comic book feel. The best way to describe it for me would be kind of a mix of X-Men and something in the tone of Frank Miller's Daredevil comic book run, which I read as a kid. There's a heavy atmosphere and dark characters and an underlying theme of what it means to be good and evil. The basic premise follows Victor and Eli, 2 college friends who discover how to give themselves superpowers or become extraordinaries. What starts out as an experiment quickly spirals into a rivalry that's more of a war between the 2 enemies that are almost mirror images of each other. You could easily compare Victor and Eli to Magneto and Professor X and their opposing ideologies, but what Schwab does so well is to blur those lines between hero and villain, showing how subjective good and evil really is. Both books have a lot of tension and grit. The characters are fascinating. Victor, Eli, and the people they gather around them are all morally gray, flawed, and sometimes straight up villainous. What I found interesting is how Schwab plays with comic book archetypes. While the characters sometimes feel like they're filling typical superhero or villain stereotypes, there's enough depth to make them feel fresh and complex. If you've read Jade City and the Greenbone Saga, and are looking for another urban fantasy series with morally ambiguous characters, Vicious and Vengeful might be right up your alley. They both explore power, revenge, and obsession in a way that's darker than your typical superhero story, and the gritty tone makes it feel more like a noir thriller. I gave both books 4 stars. I thoroughly enjoyed the ride from start to finish and can't wait to see what Schwab has in store for the 3rd book in the series whenever it does come out. Next up is Jawbone by Monica Ojeda. I talked about it in my recent video of Latin American horror books and films, so check it out if you haven't already. This is a weird book, to say the least, that not everyone is going to like. To give you a quick overview, Jawbone follows a group of adolescent girls at a prestigious private school in Ecuador, and things take a twisted turn when one of their teachers kidnaps one of the girls. But this isn't a horror story about violence. It dives deeper into the psyche, exploring themes of power, fear, and the fluid nature of reality. I guess this portrayal of captivity might make you think of, for example, Stephen King and what he did with his novel Misery. Jawbone is written in a beautifully experimental style with prose that can feel disorienting but captivating, exactly what a story like this needs. Some might call Ojeda's writing pretentious, but I find that criticism misses the point. Her prose is sharp and sophisticated, pulling you into a dreamlike atmosphere that echoes the work of H.P. Lovecraft. If you've read Lovecraft, you'll notice a similar dread lurking in the pages of Jawbone, particularly the way Ojeda toys with the perception of reality. There's even a chapter containing just one long essay concerning H.P. Lovecraft embedded in the story. It reminds me very much of the Horror 101 essays in Stephen Graham Jones's My Heart is a Chainsaw. Both serve as meta layers that comment on the horror genre they exist in, grounding their wild stories in familiar territory, and it's a great nod to horror fans. However, on a similar note, one aspect that didn't quite work for me was the abundance of pop culture references. While not inherently bad, they felt a bit too frequent, and I think they risk holding Jawbone back from becoming a timeless classic. When a novel leans heavily into contemporary references, it can sometimes date the material, and I fear this might have been the case here. It's a small gripe, but still worth noting. I also want to give credit to the translator Sarah Booker. Her work is what brings Ojeda's complex prose to an English-speaking audience without losing its distinct voice. She does a fantastic job maintaining the atmosphere and unsettling beauty of Ojeda's writing, which can't be easy with such experimental and stylistically rich text. Now, the feminist themes in Jawbone are central to the story, and they're rooted in Ecuadorian and Latin American culture. Ojeda weaves in issues like bodily autonomy and female sexuality. In a country where abortion is criminalized and patriarchal norms are deeply entrenched, the horror faced by these girls reflect real societal struggles. There's a profound sense of tension between agency and victimhood, and Ojeda subverts traditional expectations by giving these adolescent girls power, even through violence. For me, this blend of feminist commentary and psychological horror elevates the novel beyond its genre, making it a powerful piece of literary horror. It's disturbing, hell yes, but it has a purpose. Everything unsettling serves the themes of the narrative and never is just for shock value. So while it's not an easy read, I highly recommend it to anyone who appreciates horror that pushes boundaries, both in storytelling and societal commentary. In the end, Jawbone is a disturbing, beautiful, and fiercely feminist novel that I'll be thinking about for a long time. This was a 4.5-star read for me. Last up is my favorite read of the month, The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim, a recent release that absolutely captivated me. The feminist psychological horror follows Ji-won, whose life begins to spiral after her father's affair and subsequent abandonment. As her family disintegrates and her academic performance crumbles, she becomes haunted by disturbing dreams of blue eyes and an even darker obsession with eating them. This story is inventive, unsettling, and unlike anything I've read before. Kim dives deep into themes of rage, obsession, and the need for familial connection, cementing her as a bold new voice in horror. The way she builds tension and creates atmosphere is fantastic, especially when it comes to the body horror. If you're squeamish, be prepared, because this one does not hold back at points. There are several moments that made me think of the infamous eyeball scene from Evil Dead 2, except in this book, the description is far more vivid and grotesque. Imagine the same level of shock, but with descriptions of the eyeball's taste and texture. The book does start off slowly, with the first half feeling more like a character study of Ji-won and her family dynamics, but even in the slower moments, it's compelling. Kim digs into the emotional core of Ji-won's unraveling, and when the horror does ramp up in the second half, it gets truly visceral, and the violence is described in such a raw, brutal way that it's hard to not be affected. I found the ending incredibly satisfying, but if I had to critique it, it did feel a little undercooked compared to the intensity of the rest of the book. One of the things I loved most about this novel is its social critique. Kim skillfully tackles issues of racism, misogyny, and the fetishization faced by Asian women. Ji-won is a complex protagonist who you can't help but root for, even when she's doing horrific things like, well, eating eyeballs. There's a fascinating and perhaps intentional parallel here to The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, though perhaps I'm reaching with this. In The Bluest Eye, Pekala longs to have blue eyes out of a deep sense of inadequacy tied to experiences with racism. In The Eyes Are the Best Part, Ji-won's obsession with blue eyes also speak to the destructive effects of racism and misogyny, specifically through the lens of the white male gaze. But unlike Pekala, Ji-won doesn't want to be passive or conform to societal ideals. She wants to gruesomely cut out the blue eyes and consume them, rejecting the hypersexualization and objectification she faces as an Asian American woman. This novel takes a direct swing at societal stereotypes of Asian women being submissive or defenseless, and literally turns into a horror narrative about attacking the male gaze. It's sharp, unsettling, and incredibly timely. If you're looking for a book that blends terrifying body horror with poignant social commentary, The Eyes Are the Best Part is a must-read. I gave this one 4.5 stars. And that wraps up everything I read in September. Thank you so much for hanging out with me in the Haunted Library. This was a great reading month for me, and I'm really excited to dive into October. To stay in the Halloween mood, I'm planning to read only horror, with the exception of Rhythm of War, which I should finish in the next week or so. Before I go, I want to give a quick shout out to some of the other content I've got going on. If you enjoyed hearing me talk about Jawbone, I recently put out a whole video on Latin American horror books and films, so check that out if you're into it. And if you're looking for some scary books or movie recommendations to read or watch this spooky season, I recently released a horror book recommendation and TBR list for the fall season, and another video of 31 plus scary movie recommendations for Halloween. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and subscribe, because how many other booktubers are referencing Evil Dead and Toni Morrison in the same review? I'm one of a kind. Until next time, feel free to drop a comment below and let me know what books you've been loving lately. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time here in the Haunted Library. Happy reading, everyone.